welcome to Indus News. Live from Islamabad, I'm Naila Shuja, and these are the headlines. Israeli opposition parties have reached an agreement to form a new government, ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year tenure. Opposition leader Yair Lapid announced the formation of an 8-faction coalition just before the deadline on Wednesday midnight. Under a rotation arrangement, right-wing Yamina Party's head, Naftali Bennett, would serve as Prime Minister first before handing over to Lapid. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says Islamabad's foremost priority is peace in Afghanistan. In a statement, Qureshi said a trilateral virtual meeting of Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan is taking place today to discuss the Afghan peace. He added Pakistan and China can play an important role for reconstruction of Afghanistan after establishment of peace there. Indian forces have martyred a youth in custody in occupied Jammu and Kashmir's Pulwama district. The detained youth was tortured to death in the Thral police station of the district. The occupying troops have martyred more than 325 civilians since revocation of the valley in August 2019. The EU's envoy says an agreement can be reached at the next round of talks being held in Vienna to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Meanwhile, Iran's negotiator Abbas Araghchi says there are still sticking points in the talks, but these issues are not irresolvable. The latest round of talks in Vienna has been adjourned for a week. India has registered over 134,000 coronavirus cases and almost 2,900 new deaths overnight. Pakistan has recorded 92 more COVID-19 deaths and over 2,000 cases in the past 24 hours. Meanwhile, global death toll has surpassed 3.6 million, while over 171 million have tested positive for the virus so far. For more news and details, stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back. Israeli opposition parties have reached an agreement to form a new government, ending Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's 12-year tenure. Opposition leader Yair Lapid announced the formation of an 8-faction coalition just before the deadline on Wednesday midnight. In a tweet, Lapid said he has informed President Reuven Rivlin of the deal. Lapid was tasked to form the new government after Netanyahu failed to put together a coalition following Israel's fourth election in less than 2 years. Under a rotation arrangement, right-wing Yamina Party's head, Naftali Bennett, would serve as Prime Minister first before handing over to Lapid. However, the agreement still needs to be voted on in the Knesset, where it requires majority support before the government can be sworn in. If the coalition fails to win a majority, there is a risk of the country having to go to elections for the 5th time. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says Islamabad's foremost priority is peace in Afghanistan. In a statement, Qureshi said Pakistan and China can play an important role for the reconstruction of Afghanistan after establishment of peace there. He said a trilateral virtual meeting of Islamabad, Beijing, and Kabul is taking place today to discuss the Afghan issues. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi will preside over the 4th trilateral foreign ministers' dialogue. Islamabad hosted the 3rd round of dialogue in 2019, during which the three sides agreed on initial projects for enhancing counterterrorism cooperation. The first and second meetings were held in Beijing and Kabul in 2017 and 2018, respectively. Indian forces have martyred a youth in custody in occupied Jammu and Kashmir's Pulwama district. The detained youth was tortured to death in Thral police station of the district. A brother of the victim has already been martyred during a cordon and search operation in 2019. Meanwhile, a complete blackout will be observed on Friday night in protest against the Indian state terrorism in the territory. The protest call has been given by the Hurriyat leaders, civil societies, trade unions, and other Kashmiri groups. The occupying forces killed 14 civilians and injured 28 others during the last month of May. The Indian troops have martyred more than 325 civilians since the revocation of the valley in August 2019. The EU says an agreement can be reached at the next round of Vienna talks being held to revive the Iran nuclear deal. Meanwhile, Iran's negotiator Abbas Araghchi also says the next round of talks will likely be final. EU's envoy Enrique Mora told reporters in Vienna that some political and technical issues remain, but he said there are fewer issues than 1 week ago and the parties are on good track. Mora said delegations from China, Russia, Germany, France, Britain, Iran, and the U.S. will return home. They will brief their governments and meet again in the Austrian capital next week. He said every state has to give a green light to their respective delegations to get the agreement. The United States has imposed sanctions on 3 Bulgarians and 64 companies over alleged corruption. The U.S. Treasury Department said the sanctions also hit oligarch Vasil Boskov, who was accused of supporting Russia against the Bulgarian government. The Treasury Department, in a statement, called the move its single biggest action to date against corruption. The curbs blocked the entities from accessing the U.S. financial system, freezing any of their U.S. assets. After sanctions, Bulgarian interim Prime Minister Stefan Yanev has assured Washington of fighting corruption together. The sanctions come before the July 11th snap parliamentary elections in Bulgaria and after massive anti-corruption protests in 2020. India has registered over 134,000 coronavirus cases and almost 2,900 deaths overnight. Meanwhile, the global death toll has surpassed 3.6 million, with more than 171 million infections so far. More in this report.
In the fight against the coronavirus, rich countries with enormous sources fared better, while the poor mostly remained at the mercy of global relief agencies. India's government has inked a deal with domestic vaccine maker Biological E for 300 million doses, the first such order for unapproved shots. This comes as a second wave continues to devastate India, claiming thousands of lives every day. In Nepal, climbers returning from Mount Everest are struggling to find a flight back home after the country banned most air travel. The International Labour Organization says at least 220 million people are expected to remain unemployed globally this year, exacerbating existing inequalities.
This new financing facility will allow COVAX to rapidly acquire vaccines for sub-Saharan African countries under the cost-sharing scheme. Our efforts will also be boosted further by those donations from several governments, which will help accelerate equitable access through COVAX. And once again, I thank them for their generous contributions.
Meanwhile, dozens of countries and private donors pledged nearly $2.4 billion to the COVAX vaccine sharing plan. Meanwhile, after months of deliberations, U.S. President Joe Biden has finalized his plan to distribute millions of coronavirus vaccines worldwide. Pot-banging protests erupted across Brussels as President Jair Bolsonaro addressed the nation, just days after people took to the streets over his handling of the pandemic. Over in the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson says it is still unclear how protected the population will be against the new surge.
We've got to be so cautious because there's no question the ONS data of infection rates is showing an increase. We always knew that was going to happen. Don't forget, we always said that the unlocking steps that we've taken would lead to increases in infection.
Kuwait has approved GlaxoSmithKline and Vir Biotechnology's Sotrovimab as a treatment for coronavirus. Meanwhile, a new study has suggested that some COVID-19 survivors with persistent breathing symptoms have a condition called air trapping. Researchers say inhaled air gets stuck in the small airways of the lung and cannot be exhaled.
In Pakistan, 92 more people have died of coronavirus over the past 24 hours. The health ministry says the country's death toll has topped 21,000. The ministry reported over 2,000 infections overnight, pushing the nationwide caseload above 926,000. There are currently over 3,600 critical cases in the country, while over 852,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. The ministry said more than 51,000 tests were conducted since yesterday. Meanwhile, the country has also started to schedule the coronavirus vaccinations for those who are over 18 years old. Pakistan has initiated a dialogue with the United Kingdom, Germany and Canada for the country's first nature bond. Prime Minister Imran Khan inaugurated the event on green financing innovations in Islamabad. Addressing the ceremony, Imran Khan said Pakistan's contribution to carbon emission is less than 1%. He said Pakistan is one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change, and it needs to achieve target of 10 billion trees project. The Prime Minister added Pakistan will take the lead in the global efforts for environmental protection. During the event, the World Bank's Blue Carbon Study was presented for the first time, giving economic value to Pakistan's marine wealth. An MOU with China's Elon Group was also signed for plotting green ecological zones in Pakistan. The U.S. has reiterated the commitment to help Saudi Arabia defend its territory and people. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin discussed regional security issues in a phone call with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In a statement, Pentagon said both leaders particularly focused on efforts to end the war in Yemen. It said Austin thanked the Crown Prince for working with U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Tim Lenderking, to end the Yemen war. Austin also noted that Saudi Arabia's recent successes in defeating Houthi attacks on the kingdom. Meanwhile, UN Security Council will meet this week to discuss a long-abandoned fuel tanker off Yemen's coast seized by the Houthis. Israel's defense chief Benny Gantz is set to travel to the U.S. to seek a $1 billion replenishment of Iron Dome air defense system. This comes in the wake of an 11-day escalation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, killing over 250 Palestinians. Israel's defense ministry said Gantz would meet U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and other security officials for discussion on the issue. Meanwhile, Gaza's director of UN Refugee Agency has been called in for consultation with his bosses after his controversial remarks. Protests erupted over Matthias Shamal's interview, in which he said he didn't dispute Israel's assertion that its airstrikes were precise. Earlier, the Israeli army said it arrested a senior Hamas leader, Sheikh Jamal al-Thawli, in the West Bank, accusing him of setting up a base there. The World Health Organization has warned of staggering health needs in Palestine after last month's Israeli airstrikes on Gaza. The WHO's regional office said it is scaling up its response to provide health aid for almost 200,000 Palestinians in need. In a statement, the WHO called for unhindered access for humanitarian and development-related supplies into Gaza as the situation there is volatile. Earlier, UN Refugees Agency in Gaza said Palestinians' forceful expulsion from their homes violates international law. It urged Israel to stop the forceful expulsions from the Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods in the West Bank. The U.S. says it is looking at a possible retaliation from Russia after it linked Moscow to a cyber attack against global meat processing giant JBS. The ransomware attack on Brazilian-owned firm has again prompted accusations that Russia harbors cyber criminals.
Talking to reporters, President Joe Biden said Washington is closely monitoring the issue. The White House said Biden will raise the issue of cyber attacks with Russian President Vladimir Putin during the summit on 16th of June. At a news briefing, Press Secretary Jen Psaki reiterated that responsible states do not harbor cyber criminals. Psaki added Washington believes that Moscow has a role to play in preventing these cyber attacks. Earlier, the FBI attributed the ransomware attack to a Russian cyber criminal group named Revil. In a statement, the agency said it is working diligently to bring the threat actors to justice. Meanwhile, JBS says it has resumed a majority of its global operations, including in the U.S. and Australia.
Flights between Germany and Russia have resumed after a brief suspension in a tit-for-tat move as part of a diplomatic spat over Belarus. Both states had earlier blocked the passage of each other's airplanes in an apparent tit-for-tat move. German airline Lufthansa said the Russian authorities have finally granted it clearance for passenger flights to Russia. Another Russian airline, S7, also said it has also received clearance for its flights to land in Germany. Earlier, German Transport Ministry had blocked flights operated by Russian airlines from arriving in its territory. The ministry said Lufthansa had to cancel flights on Wednesday because they did not receive Russian permission in time. It's now time for a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Japan is expecting a snap election after the July 23rd Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has ordered not to extend the parliamentary session beyond June 16th when it comes to an end. The media reported the government is also considering producing a new economic stimulus package before the expected snapped election. Tokyo will also not produce a supplementary budget, but instead tap on 4 trillion yen of reserves to spend on COVID-19 recovery. Slow vaccination rollout in Japan and Suga's continued push for the Games has greatly declined his popularity. Suga has said that he would focus on dealing with the pandemic and Japan will go ahead with the Games under strict virus protection measures. 2 UN officials from the High Commissioner for Refugees have called on Bangladesh to provide education and jobs to the Rohingya. They met Bangladesh's Foreign Minister A.K. Abdul Momen on the last day of their 4-day official tour. Assistant High Commissioner for Protection Gillian Triggs said Rohingya children have no future without education. Triggs and UN's Assistant High Commissioner for Operations Rauf Mazou came to Bangladesh to assess and discuss the Rohingya issue. Both UN officials assured Dhaka they will work for the peaceful repatriation of Rohingya to their home country, Myanmar. However, they said the situation of Myanmar has been very difficult since the February 1st military coup. The International Criminal Court has asked Sudan to hand over one of the key people accused of war crimes and genocide in Darfur. Sudan's former President Omar Hassan Bashir and his 4 allies face charge of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In a press briefing, Chief ICC Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda said Bashir, who is imprisoned in Sudan, is still wanted by the court. She said the court is willing to negotiate with the Sudanese government on where his trial should be held. Bensouda said ICC investigators will travel to Darfur to continue speaking with the victims of the violence as crimes are still ongoing. The conflict in Sudan's western region killed an estimated of 300,000 people and displaced 2.5 million others in 2002. The U.S. and Mexico have promised to work for orderly, safe, and regular migration. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met his Mexican counterpart Marcelo Ebrard in San Jose, Costa Rica. During the meeting, the two leaders discussed a fair and equal distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. They also discussed preparations ahead of the Mexico visit of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris on the 8th of June. The State Department says they mulled issues challenging regional democracy, governance, and security. Blinken is traveling to Costa Rica to hold talks with regional leaders and discuss U.S. investment in the region. In the U.S. state of Minneapolis, prosecutors have asked a judge to sentence the former police officer convicted of murdering George Floyd to 30 years in prison. The 45-year-old Derek Chauvin was convicted on the 20th of April and was jailed immediately. Prosecutors in Minnesota made the request in court documents sent ahead of the 25th June sentence hearing. They called Chauvin's actions an abuse of his position, adding his conduct was particularly cruel. Meanwhile, Chauvin's lawyers countered with a far different request, seeking a sentence of time served and probation. Chauvin faces second-degree murder, which carries a maximum sentence of 40 years in prison. Floyd's death last year triggered the Black Lives Matter movement across the U.S. and around the world. Former U.S. President Donald Trump's blog page has been permanently removed from his website. The page, called From the Desk of Donald J. Trump, was launched last month after major social platforms banned him. The The media served as a way for Trump to publish his own content, including press releases and videos. In an interview, Trump's aide Jason Miller said the page will not be returning, calling it just an auxiliary of the broader efforts. Miller said that he does not have a precise awareness of timing, but hopes to have more information on the effort soon. A slew of social media platforms barred Trump following the Capitol Hill riots on the 6th of January that left 5 people dead. The massive sinkhole created in Santa Maria, Zacatepec in Mexico's Palubas state is continuing to expand, worrying locals. The National Defense Ministry has reported that the sinkhole is a diameter of 60 meters wide and 15 meters deep. The residents and the local farmers have been asked to avoid the area of the hole. Local activists predict that the cause of the sinking may be the overexploitation of aquifers in the area. The explorations are done by the industrial parks and working in the state. Local authorities have yet not given any further details. Thousands of Colombians hit the streets again in the latest round of anti-government protest. At least 59 people have died and over 2,300 have been injured in the unrest so far. The demonstrators, now in their second month, resumed amid a stalemate in talks between the government and protest leaders. The two sides reached a so-called pre-agreement, but the protest leaders accused the government of backtracking. The government says that the protest leaders need to condemn the roadblocks. Meanwhile, the country's defense ministry said the security forces gradually lifted some blockades, but 38 remain. A huge fire broke out at an oil refinery in the southern part of the Iranian capital of Tehran. Officials say one of the gas pipelines in the petrochemical plant burst into flames, while a tanker also caught fire. The officials say firefighters from different areas of the city, as well as the armed forces, are engaged in fire extinguishing operations. Iranian state media said the fire will be extinguished when the fuel inside the tanker is completely consumed. Meanwhile, the plant's public relations office rejected the possibility of sabotage in the incident. There are no reports of casualties so far. Sri Lanka says it is prepared for the possibility of an oil spill after a cargo ship loaded with chemicals sank off its western coast. The vessel MV Express Pearl tumbled and caught fire from an explosion on Wednesday in Colombo's coast before sinking. The ship's operator's express feeders said no evidence of an oil spill from the ship was found, and toxins on board have burned by the fire. However, photos from the state's Coast Guard show a layer of green film blanketing the ocean surrounding the vessel. Following the imagery, Sri Lanka has banned fishing along an 80-kilometer stretch of the coast. The government has said it would seek to readdress for the incident in accordance with the international law. NASA has announced plans to launch 2 scientific missions to Venus between 2028 and 2030. They aim to study the atmosphere and geologic history of the Earth's closest planetary neighbor. The 2 missions, dubbed Da Vinci Plus and Vitaris, are NASA's first Venus in decades. The U.S. Space Agency said it is awarding around $500 million for each mission. According to NASA, Da Vinci Plus will measure the composition of the dense Venusian atmosphere. It is also expected to return to the first high-resolution images of unique geological features that are comparable with Earth. Meanwhile, Vitalis will map the planet's surface to help determine its geological history. China has successfully launched the first of a new generation of meteorological satellite into its planned orbit. The satellite Fengyun BE-4 was hurled in a Long March 3B rocket from the Saicheng Center in Sichuan province. It will be used in weather analysis and forecasting, as well as environmental and disaster monitoring. Its observation range covers Asia, the Central Pacific Ocean, and the Indian Ocean regions. The launch marks the 372nd flight mission of the Long March rocket series. The U.S. says the G7 countries are expected to endorse its proposal for a 15% global corporate minimum tax. In a statement, the Treasury Department said the plan will be discussed at the meetings of finance ministers in London this week. It said a full endorsement is expected at the end of the G7 meetings with the leaders summit. Meanwhile, British Finance Minister Rishi Sunak says the proposal to focus on the world's 100 biggest firms can work, but he insisted that big tech firms must pay more tax in countries where they can operate. Earlier in an interview, German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz said that he expects the group to make significant progress on the issue. Crude oil prices have hit a two-year high, with Brent crude rising above the $71 per barrel mark. This comes after OPEC and its allies decided to stick to the plan to gradually restore supply. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude futures are trading above $68 per barrel. The OPEC Plus meeting lasted 20 minutes, the quickest in the grouping's history. It suggested strong compliance among members and conviction that demand will recover well after the pandemic. OPEC Plus data shows demand will be 99.8 million barrels per day by the end of the year versus 97.5 million BDP. European stocks have slipped from all-time highs as investors awaited U.S. economic data to gauge the future path of the monetary policy. The rating actions and ex-dividend trading knocked the UK's share lower. The host of British companies traded without entitlement for dividend, pulling UK's FTSE 100 0.7% lower. The Pan-European Stock 600 index was trading just below the flat line. Basic resource stocks with their heavy exposure to China showed the biggest losses in earlier trade, while France's CAC and the Germany DAXs shed 0.2%. It's now time to take a look at the weather updates from around the world. For the latest news updates, you can follow us on our social media at Indus.News.